Righty. So for your last lecture, I'm going to give you an overview of a simple JavaScript functionality that is very common and is almost one of the most, well, used ways we use JavaScript, and it's to validate form input. Because you have all been on websites, right? Like I could just go to Google. Well, actually, it's right there. This is a form. You input information, right? And then when you hit enter or you hit, right? Oh wow, I'm feeling lucky gone. How long has that been gone? Whenever in this case you hit enter, right? Something happens. So that is by far the most common way we use HTML, and in this case CSS to validate at least the client side. Okay. Now, having said that, you have two options for this video. You can either write the JavaScript I'm going to go over in your own contact page, or you can just create a new file called JS in the lectures, create a README file, and take notes over what I'm going to cover. So one of the first things to understand is that the JavaScript, if you're taking CIT93, some of you are from me right now, some of you might be in the future, that's focused on client side, which is by far the most common programming language is client side JavaScript. So what do we mean by client side? So in client side, the client, your computer, there's some JavaScript that's written here in order to facilitate different maybe UI, but as I said, most commonly is to handle form inputs. Because once you hit enter or you hit return on a form, the client side will validate that information to the best of its ability before it sends it to the server. And in the example I'm going to show you, we're going to handle only the client side, not the server side. But I noticed in my template, I was given a server side file, what's called a PHP. That is a type of programming language that was written in to handle that form submission. But in that case, that's beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about. What we're just going to talk about is just understanding some simple JavaScript. Okay. So let me show you the setup I ended up doing to get this done. So on my local system, and this is the other thing that I think is worth talking about just for a second, is I ended up creating a new branch. So let's just look at Git branching and why do we use it. In our case, Git branching, we don't use branching. We've used subdirectories, different repos, but branching is something that is very common in the way that you might use Git. This is a better example. So like your main branch, the branch that we've all been working on, there is often a need, especially in teams, but also with yourself. And that's what I'm going to show I'm doing here, is where you want to create a new feature, but you don't want to change the base code, the main, right? So in other words, I have a main, what you all see commonly. Oh yeah, I can't right now. I haven't saved my work. But if you look down here, you will see main. They call it master. It's the same thing. But what I'm going to do at this point, I've created a branch called contact form. And then what it did is it took all that code that I'd written here, place it into a new branch, allowed me to work here without adding anything, changing anything on the main. And then if I'm ready, I can push this, merge this into this branch. And there may be times I will, there may be times I won't, because I've just been playing around and I did not want to change that main branch. So again, this is, if you were continuing, which I hope you are, with your Git experience, branching is very logically, and I'm actually thinking of integrating it more with all my classes just to give students that experience. So to say that, I've created a branch called contact form, and that's where I've done the work on my local system in order to just play around with some JavaScript on my local system, but in a different branch. Okay, so I have live server running. Let's just go look at live server real quick. Let's see my title, new branch, who dis. So I tried to be funny. So this is a contact form, very common, right? Very common thing we do on websites is we give a contact form for somebody to contact us. And very like these are the common fields, but really what are they, right? They are a type, and you saw this in the HTML and CSS, is that in the HTML and CSS setup, or in that code along that you did, these are input fields, right? So input, 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 and then this is a text area. Now you can also right click, inspect, come over here, and it'll show you that's an input type text. Now there's a lot of other attributes. These are called attributes. And we'll talk a little about some of them, not all of them here, because I've written some code to access some of them or to utilize some of them. But in this case, here are the fields. But probably to start with, the most important one is called required. So what happens is, and this is a way we validate user input, is if somebody just comes in here and hits send message, the first thing that happens in this case is that required field or that required attribute is checked to see if that field has been filled out. So if I fill it out, okay, I tab in the next one and then I try to do, then the next one triggers. Okay, so every one of these you will see has, and you can come down through here and look at every one of them having required. And that's just, in this case, built in attributes that save us from writing so much JavaScript and let the HTML do what it's good at, which is just some basic validation. And then what we do is we write custom validation on top of that. Okay. So in this case, I'm just going to say, it's me. And then I'm going to say hello world. Okay. So at this point, once I hit submit now, assuming all of my fields are that are required to fill out, then what happens is it comes up to the form itself. And in this case, see, I have the form tag. Okay. So if we look at this, and let's just move over to HTML for a minute here, is in, if I scroll down, and one of the things I like to do is actually roll things up so I don't have to look at so much. That's a very nice thing to do inside the browser, or sorry, inside the editor. So in this case, here's my form. And this PHP, and I suspect all of you who had I think every template I saw had a contact form. Most of them had an action equals and then some kind of URL. Okay. Now, what is that? What that does is once the form has been validated, then the action is it's going to call, and in this case, I've already mentioned this, a server side. Okay. So it's going to call a server side code. It's going to run that code to execute whatever on the server side needs to happen. But because we're not going to do that for this class or for this example, I'm going to take that action off. Okay. So now once this form, it doesn't have an action, then it's going to be looking for a very common thing that we do in JavaScript. It's called an event listener. Now I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but it's just showing you the output or the handling of the form itself. So if I right click in here and I hit inspect, I will see there's a form, or sorry, there's a button here, and the button type is submit. So what we're doing is we're listening for, and if I come over here into my dev tools, I see that there is a submit right here. So there's in this file called contact.js, which is the code that I wrote, there's some code listening for an event. Okay. And then once that, and let's just fill it out. I guess I refresh the page. Okay. This is where, okay, hit submit. Then that event listener, which I'm going to show you the code for that in a minute, once that runs, okay, once that actually gets executed, then it outputs some content to the page. That's it's not even, well, it's not form validation. It's just capturing the content from, and in this case, the name and the message, and outputting it back to the user just to show you and talk about that form submission process. Okay. Now, let's actually go look at the code itself. So in my example, in my template, there was a JS directory in my assets folder. Okay. And in there, I had already a main. And this was provided to me by the template. And I could have wrote my JavaScript in here, but it just didn't make sense because there's so much content in there and it gets a little confusing. Okay. So what I'd want to do is actually just not write my code in there. I created another file called a contact.js. Now you can generally name these files pretty much, I don't want to say whatever you want because main is common, index.js, app.js. And because I already had a main, I named my one that is going to be specific to the code that is going to handle that in a file called contact.js. But now what I need to do before I even start talking about this code is go into my contact and see how I included or how I connected my HTML to my CSS. Okay. Now, in this case, when I was looking at my form, okay, or when I was looking at my HTML, what I noticed, and I think it's still here, I don't think I moved it. Oh, I must have moved. I'm not even using it. That's what happened is I removed it. I noticed that my main.js was down at the bottom right before the end of the body tag. And the reason you will often see that is people are programmers, developers, designers are not using what's called the deferred attribute. Okay, because here's what happens. And this is where you start to understand the underneath of what you've been dealing with as far as here's the rendered page, but really that rendered page in programming language and JavaScript or in the browser itself is what we call the DOM, the document object model. Okay, so if I was to type document down here in the console and hit enter, that would give me, if I roll over it, you see it actually highlights the whole page because when the browser loads the HTML, the CSS, the JavaScript, everything that it needs, what gets created from that is a DOM, a document object model, which is really what we then use JavaScript to manipulate. Okay, so that's an important concept. Now, it's not that anyway, that's what we're doing is we're manipulating the DOM, the document, with our JavaScript. Okay. Now, where I put it, I showed you before, it was up here in the head. I used the deferred. So now let's go over to that contact. Okay. Which, by the way, remember how we did the link for the CSS? In this case, you use script, you do source, and then you point the relative URL here, or not URL, but reference to your local system, and then do that JS file. Okay, and then you end that. Oh, actually, I did put it up here, and then I just commented out because I realized I didn't need it for what I was doing. Okay, but it was at the bottom because it didn't have the deferred. Again, why do we need to defer it? Okay, because if we're writing JavaScript, that's actually what I was originally doing here. If we're writing JavaScript that manipulates that DOM has to be loaded. And in order for that, in order for it to be really what we mean rendered and loaded, we have to defer this file until that DOM is ready for us to do something to it. And there's ways that we used to do this on window load, but deferred is just so much easier. And it just says wait to load this until the DOM is ready. Okay. Okay, so now let's actually go look a little bit at that contact.js. So the first thing I did is I just did a console log to say connected, just to show you. And if you look down here, I'm just going to refresh the page real quick. There is this connected because I wanted to first do that just to make sure my JavaScript was connected. So if you're writing this and you want to get this to work, that's the first thing I'd recommend. So that way you know is if your HTML and your CSS is actually connected together, meaning they're logically the index is referencing the JS file. Okay. So now what I have is I have a constant, which const is a variable declaration for a constant, and I have capitalized FORM. Now, the way I've capitalized it here is not because it's required by JavaScript, it's more of a style. And that's a very common thing with JavaScript is that you can do things different ways, but often you want to conform to whatever, not often, especially if you're working for somebody, they'll have a style guide they want you to write to. Kind of like MLA, like MLA has a style at which you do research references, right? Well, there's a style guide for JavaScript. And when you learn from somebody, they often will give you their style of writing JavaScript. And I try to kind of conform to kind of the standard of which I've read. So now, where do you read about JavaScript? Most common, MDN. Most common reference for JavaScript. But the thing is, this is meant for a technical reference. And people who go in and try to just read it without having experience, it can be a little daunting. But it is a wealth of knowledge. And trust me, I look at MDN almost every day. Okay. Because when I'm doing something, when I'm writing some JavaScript, I can't always remember how to do something. I go look at it. Okay. Now back to here. Back to here. So what are these lines doing? Let's actually talk about this. So document I already showed you. So it's referencing the DOM and it's saying get element by ID and then it says form. Well, let's actually see it rather than to just reference it. So when that line runs, and here's the other cool thing, and if you do take my JavaScript, trust me, you will learn this, is most of the time we've been dealing over here with elements, but there's console and there's sources. And over on sources, if I scroll through and I find the JS file that I'm talking about, I can see it here. And then I can set what's called breakpoints so that I have my JavaScript when it executes, because there's actually a way in which the JavaScript itself executes. And there's that is a whole almost 2-hour discussion if you really wanted to go. Just know generally once it does a couple of rounds of setting up, like in this case an event listener, which I'll talk about in a minute, it runs from top to bottom. Okay, so I can stop it from actually, and when I say run, I mean execute. I can stop it here, I can stop it anywhere and look at what it's doing. And the way I look at it is I can go over here and hit refresh. And then notice how now it actually has this line highlighted, and there's these nice little icons over here that allow me to now step through my code. And this is called debugging your code, and it's one of the most common things you do in any kind of programming language is you're debugging your code. So in this case, I've already executed line 2, so I could come down to my console, and if you don't see console, you can say show console drawer, and it comes here. So if I type form right now, because that line already executed, and then I hit enter, what happens here is that reference, that variable points to the document. And in that document, it's saying, hey, look for get element by ID, that form. Now, where was that ID? Remember, I showed it. We'll go look at it, but it's right here on the form, that ID. So what it does is it says, hey, look in the DOM, find the element called form and its reference, which is the HTML that has been created, give that to me in that variable. And that's really, really helpful because then I can do things like I'm about to do here, where I'm going to do other functionality, add that to that. In addition, I did another one, and I'm just going to step into this line because all it did was set it up. And in this case, I had another one called send, but in that case, you're not seeing it because I haven't got any content in it yet. You can see where it's at down here in the bottom, right? Down there. And that's where when the code executes, then it's going to update this area down here in the bottom. All right. So now let's talk about this. All right. And hopefully what you're doing is taking notes along the way. I talked about some key things about JavaScript, about client side. I've talked about branching so far. I've talked about variable declaration. I've talked about the DOM, right? So there's just, what I really want to do is just give you some of this verbiage because trust me, the more you, and I hope you do take JavaScript because I love JavaScript, but that's me. All right, so let's talk about this. So now on this line, on line 5, is really where we start to see the power of writing JavaScript to handle the DOM, because JavaScript by itself would not be able to do this. What we're doing is we're writing, because JavaScript, like anything, is just a programming language. And you can learn just the language itself before you learn how to manipulate the DOM. And I've used enough Udemy courses, I've written enough JavaScript to know sometimes it's good just to know the language, but because once you introduce that language into the browser, it looks very different. I find doing them at the same time is helpful. And that's the way I teach it. And what I mean by that is like knowing how to declare a variable, knowing how to declare arrays, which is a way to keep a list of things, a way to write functions. This is a function here. It's actually a special function called a callback function, but whatever. So you learn that structure, and then you understand how to manipulate the DOM on top of it, or how to reference the DOM. But in this case, we're going, hey, on the form, add an event listener, which is exactly what it's doing. It's going to listen for an event. I was showing you this earlier, and it's listening for a submit. And we could listen for a lot of different things on the page, okay? But what this is saying is when somebody clicks the submit, right, then I want you to run this, and this is called a function. Now, this is called a kind of a special function because it's a callback function, like I said before, but it is still just a function. And function is a block of code that you can run that does a series of commands and that may output or return a value. But in this case, it just runs these commands in sequence. Okay, so the first thing it does is it says, hey, prevent default. And you might be going, what the heck, right? Remember how I was talking about client side versus server side? Right? That the server side, we're writing only client side JavaScript. Well, because, go back here, because we're writing client side JavaScript, HTML by its default will assume we're actually going to send this to a server. So by default, it will try to do that. But we're saying by adding this line, no, we're going to handle this form submission with our own code. You don't have to work. You don't even try to send it to the server. So now we're going to set up, in this case, 4 variables. And let me just show you now that we're here, because now we're just setting these up. Okay. So I'm just going to, so this is JavaScript loading, and now it's set up. Stop this for a minute. Okay. And just let this run and let it run. Because in this case, this JavaScript is now set up, and now it's listening for this event. And until I submit this event, this code does not get executed yet. Okay, which is why my breakpoint up here stopped it, but it didn't run any of this code yet, because all that happened was this got set up in memory. So if I fill this out, okay, hello, and hello again. When I click this, this code will run. So now let me set a breakpoint in here and hit send. And now I can see a lot of information, but more than anything, there's an event. Remember I was talking about this is an add event listener? Well, here's the event that it was listening for, and that's all the data. There's a ton of it. Like if you come down here, I'm going to clear this real quick. Just type E, because when you're suspended with code, you can reference all of these variables. I could actually look at it here, scrolling across, but it's just easier for me to look at it here and show you that this is the data. Now, it may not seem a lot, but if you drill down, it actually shows you the current targets. Okay, it shows you the button. The ARIA, remember we were talking about ARIA and the accessibility. It shows you those settings. It shows you the child nodes. It shows you the class list. I mean, there's just a ton of stuff, because imagine just so many different ways somebody would want to respond to an event. We're just saying, hey, for this, we're going to set up a variable. We're going to declare a variable in this scope. Now, scope is where something is accessible. So we're inside of a block. So this is called block scope. This is called global scope, which means anywhere I write code, I have access to these variables I've declared or other types of things. But in this case, I'm writing block scope, so it's only available inside of here. Okay, so what is E? And we'll just do this, E dot target dot name dot, or let's just do name. So if you do that, you see that that references the event target name. So if you scroll over it, you can see it's highlighted that input. And when we say, okay, and I can just up arrow here, give me the value of that, then it reaches inside of there and then references now the value. So if I'm setting when I'm doing these lines, I'm just saying, hey, store in a block scope variable. Now again, the reason they're not capitalized is because you capitalize constants that are out on the global scope, which by the way, just because I think it's worth saying, you will see code these days where people do let, okay? And let would be setting of a variable that you might change its declaration later, being maybe it's something else. If you see var, that means somebody's writing old JavaScript. But most of the time, unless there's a need, and often there may be, you generally write const. It's just is safer. So now we'll walk and look at what I'm doing. I'm stepping through these lines. And what I love about DevTools, and it's the way I teach JavaScript, is it shows you what each line, when it executes, is doing. So it's saying, I'm going to grab those values, I'm going to reference those values, I'm going to store that value in a variable. And now I'm going to do some more work to actually update the DOM. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set another variable called P. I'm going to say document DOM, create element, create a new element that's a P element. Remember me telling you that we couldn't see anything on the page? That's because that div called send, if you want to see that, let's just see that real quick. So if I go into my HTML, I scroll down here at the bottom, there it is, right? That's a div. There's nothing in there, okay? But I'm saying create a new element, a P paragraph. On that P, set its text content to, in this case, what we call a template string. It's just some output that allows me to inject these variables into some kind of string. So it's saying take that P context. Now there's different ways to do this. Set its value on the P to this, and let's just go ahead and step and step. So now I could come down here and I could type P, okay? And now it shows me what that output element is going to look like, but notice it's not on the page yet. And this is because we create new DOM elements, but we haven't done line 13, which says, hey, reference that div and append child, meaning place inside that new, place inside of it, that P reference that I just, that's horrible. Anyway, that reference to that paragraph that I just created. So this is actually what creates the output. So if I step into it, that's when that line gets created. Okay, last thing I would do, and again, this is a horribly simplified example, but at least gives you some what JavaScript is doing in some cases, is I'm going to say on that form, because remember, you've been on forms when you've submitted them. Notice almost always they clear the input. And what I'm doing here is kind of an older way to say form dot reset that form. So what happens is, watch when this line runs, it clears those inputs. Now, what you've seen here is a really general introduction to JavaScript. Okay, there's so much more we do with JavaScript, but starting to understand variables. We didn't even talk about arrays. We talked about event listeners, which is common. We talked about functions a little bit. We talked about scope a little bit, right? We talked about the reference for the most common used reference besides Stack Overflow, which is where people post questions. The other thing, and I will kind of end with this, is that in the editor now, and I don't have mine highlighted, I have it here somewhere, to where you can even use what's called the Copilot inside of GitHub to help you write code as well. It's a great way to but the thing I've noticed with most people who do this is when they use, and this is an AI kind of reference, you could do the same thing on GDP, is that if you use those and you don't have a programming understanding or understanding of the programming logic and the ways at which you create logic for web pages, that output's not going to make sense. Okay, but there is built-in functionality to help you do that once you learn a language. All right, back here. So if you got on your contact page for your template some kind of output, then commit that work and give me that URL. If you just did some notes along the way for some of the things I went over several times and understand them, then give me that. And either way, you can, if you want, in your submission box, tell me, was this helpful at all? And I know it was really quick. Like I said, I struggled. If you want to see the other 30-minute video I created that actually wrote the code for this, let me know and I will give you that. I'll talk to you later.